Steve, I thought that the job occupation of librarian was one that was like going away in society because does anyone remember card catalogs? That was a thing. Card catalogs. I'm old enough to remember my parents showing me a card catalog. And then it was like, oh, we don't really need libraries. People were like, but I don't think that's true. I think that's in fact what all these search engines are. I've been learning so much about
They're really just big fancy card catalogs?
they're big
you're saying?
fancy card catalogs, and you got to go to about as much work to get your stuff found there as you do with the card catalog. Like someone's got to go in there and write it out. We've been learning so much about YouTube and how these episodes of MedTech Crossroads get consumed and how people go and look at them and how they find out what they're looking for. I'll tell you just a bit more about that before we really get the show going here. It turns out that YouTube is used for three things. One is entertainment. And I mean, we're not shooting for that here, right? Like this is.
Are you sure?
Well, it's pretty dry stuff. I mean, come on, to be honest. MedTech, it can be pretty dry. I mean,
Fair enough.
but we do our best, right? Inspiration is the other one. Inspirational things like, hey, this is going to get you off dead center, get you doing something. I hope we do a little bit of that. And the big one is education, right? It's like so many people are going to YouTube because they're asking, how do I X? Or what is the latest on X? I want to learn about this. It's often last minute. And then the challenge for the content creator becomes, how do I find out what they're asking? And how do I get the latest that actually they do need to know? Because for years we've thought about presentations as, this is what people need to know. Well, cool, but only if they're there to consume it, right? Only if they're to find out about it. So how do you bridge that last mile between the latest things that are happening and how it applies to people in the particular niche, right? Like in this case, medtech development. How do you bridge that with their actual needs? And that's what we've been learning about a lot. So while the format of our live show isn't changing, what we're doing now is we're taking the segments. You'll notice little pauses in between the segments. We're going to have some fun up front. We're going to do the events at the end like we used to do those at the beginning. We're doing all the events at the end. The only place you're getting the events is if you go back and listen to the live show. But the segments in the middle, including interviews. We've got an interview coming up next week. Jeff Reinveldt's going to be with us from Renaissance Venture Partners. But each of those segments is going to be broken up and each one served up separately, along with helpful keywords so people can find them later on. And we've already been noticing a bump in people getting to see the content, hear what's going on. So as we sort of reinvent MedTech Crossroads for, I think, the third time in its life, I'm really excited about this. It's a really fun time to be in. We've got some cool segments coming up today. Up next on MedTech Crossroads. I had to wait for the music to stop because we're doing this segmented now. So it's like, wow. Okay, well, here we go. Do FDA standards change over time? How do FDA standards influence the clearance process? How often do FDA standards change? On this segment of MedTech Crossroads, we're going to answer these questions as we look at some newly added FDA consensus standards and talk about what it means for medtech companies. MedTech Crossroads is brought to you by Into-Being, your medical device development partner. Free learning for MedTech Crossroads will save you headaches on your medical device development journey. So let's get into this one. For this, we need to distinguish between the idea of regulations and the idea of standards. I should pick a different brush. Those two terms are not synonymous in FDA land. Right? If we're thinking about FDA regulations, we're thinking about the CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations that Congress passes. If we're thinking about standards, we're thinking about things that have been issued by standards organizations. Here's a standards organization like ISO. Right? ISO is one of those. And if you go to iso.org, the link will be there. I'm not recommending them. There's many standards organizations, and the particular standard you don't really get to pick. It's from whoever it's from. You can get to standards through websites. You usually have to purchase them. They're usually not free. They're a few $100s each. You can buy those directly from organizations like ISO, or you can buy them through organizations like ANSI, which will often have versions of the standard. So there's ANSI's website, and you can access standards over here. Again, not an endorsement, but just the standards come from different international standards organizations, and then they can be resold directly or through these other organizations. Well, how does this relate to FDA? It turns out that FDA does what we call consensing standards. There's going to be a link in the video, but for the FDA Consensus Standards database, FDA will consensus certain, but not all, standards. The fact that a standard is out does not mean that FDA has recognized it. Okay, so not the latest versions necessarily, but the ones that FDA has consensused, you can search them through this interface from FDA. Now, what does it mean for a standard to be consensused? Does that mean you have to follow it? Does that mean that now it's an FDA requirement? Not exactly. It's called a recognized consensus standard for a reason. Consensus meaning there is international consensus around this standard. It's recognized meaning the FDA has recognized it. What it basically means is FDA is saying, if you do this, we won't have to ask you these kinds of questions. In some sense, it is still optional, and it is called a voluntary standard. Now, there are times when a standard is required. If you look here for a product classification, this one happens to be for an anesthetic conduction needle. I just picked one. It's a Class 2 device requiring a 510K. But it turns out it lists a recognized consensus standard. You're going to want to follow that standard if you're going for this product code. That's really not going to be an option. Also, standards like 14971, which are consensused, and they say that they apply to all medical devices, well, chances are you're probably going to want to follow that one. In fact, if you can find a consensus standard that applies, it's really in your best interests to use it. You don't want to avoid consensus standards when they exist. But there are times when a consensus standard doesn't quite apply, and if it really truly doesn't, you don't necessarily have to follow it. You might work with FDA directly to negotiate how you're going to prove either substantial equivalence or safety and efficacy. So it turns out that there is an FDA guidance on this one from 2018, the appropriate use of, there it is, voluntary consensus standards in pre-market submissions for medical devices. Pre-market submissions are not just 510Ks, right? These could be other forms like a de novo or like a PMA. There's a lot of stuff in here. We won't cover this entire standard today. The link is in the description. But what you're going to be doing with standards is making declarations of conformity to the standard, telling the agency we comply with this, often putting forward test results from a third-party test agency to demonstrate your conformity to the standard. But standards aren't forever. Standards do change, and that's the whole subject here today that we're talking about. There are transition periods that you go through for standards. And you want to know that the standard that you're following is actually recognized and will be recognized at the time period that you are making your submission. Nothing worse than going through years of development only to find out that the FDA no longer recognizes or has withdrawn the standard that you thought you were going to be complying with and did testing to. So that's why this is important. Do FDA standards change over time? Yes, they do. The way they influence the clearance process is you're going to incorporate them as a part of your design control process. Your documentation and your testing will be based in part on consensus standards. So let's take a look and see how these standards change and when they change. So it turns out that down the page here, we've got the entire guidance there, but this is the Federal Register. This is bedtime reading for you folks, the greatest thing ever if you want to fall asleep. But let's go down the page here because there's some interesting things buried in the details. FDA keeps lists of what standards they have recognized. You can get to them through the CDRH portal that I showed you just a minute ago. But it turns out that down here we actually have a list of changes, additions, withdrawals. So the first set here are modifications to the list of recognized standards. Now, lists are not always the most fun thing to go through. How might you want to listen to this? Well, these are broken up by category. The first one's going to be anesthesiology right here. So if you know what particular device type you're working on, you'd want to be listening for which of these categories your device may fall into. We're not going to go through every one, but I want to give you a flavor of how and when these standards change. Here are some ones. Pressure vessels for human occupancy for anesthesiology. Okay, so we might have a place that we're pressurizing to maybe put a person under. Well, this one has been withdrawn and replaced with a newer version. Now, that's probably not such a big deal. If you're in and working with that standard, you probably have a sense that the newer one came out if you're paying attention. But this is almost the most benign change that can happen, is for a standard just to be updated in the normal course of things and for FDA to say, we've recognized the latest version of it. Good. Now, they don't always recognize the latest version. So you do want to find out what the latest version that they recognize is. Actually do a search on the FDA website, because there have been times, 14971 being one of the prominent examples, where the FDA did not consensus the latest version of the standard. In fact, they skipped a version of the standard because it was so badly received. They jumped from one, I think it was 2007 all the way up to 2019, if I remember correctly, skipping an intermediate version of the standard. Medical suction equipment. This is all in anesthesiology. Some changes there for biocompatibility. There are intramuscular screening of medical devices. Withdrawn, replaced. Biological evaluation, transition period extended. This is not, crazy stuff. This is just something that if you're in a particular vertical, you're going to want to know about these kinds of changes. Tests for skin sensitization. No changes to cardiovascular devices. Dental, ear, nose, and throat devices. Dental base polymers. Okay, so if you're working with dental resins, you're going to want to know how that is changing. Things on quality systems and risk management, changes to that. Conditioning of packages, that's actually an important one, because packaging conditioning is something that happens before ship testing, before sterilization confirmations. You'd want to focus on that as well. So down here we've got electromagnetic compatibility, wireless. This is going to be an important one, everybody. ANSI C6327, evaluation of wireless coexistence. In the last couple of years on the show, we've seen places where wireless devices are not coexisting well together. So staying up to date on this one is going to be pretty important. And in fact, standards when they change are often minor changes, but if there's been a big issue, there's going to be a big change to the standard, one that would probably affect your compliance with it. Changes to 80601, face covering changes, in vitro diagnostics, antifungal things, materials, nanotechnology, characterization of nanotechnology. No changes to neurology, some changes to obstetrics and gynecology, some changes to ophthalmic devices and orthopedic devices, physical medicine devices. This one I found just interesting. Resistance to ignition of postural support devices for wheelchairs. This is why you want to be in these verticals. You want to be thinking about what standards apply to my device, because in fact, there used to be this standard that you were following that's been completely withdrawn, alluding to the ignition sources. Ignition. I think, the thing's going to light on fire for postural support devices for wheelchairs. It turns out, we'll find out later, that this one has been completely replaced by not a new version of a standard, but by a completely new standard. So we'll get to that in a second. Radiologies, there are changes to various standards, some changes to 60601 for X-ray equipment and radiography and radioscopy equipment. Software and informatics, medical device interoperability, and sterility. No changes to tissue engineering at this time. We didn't get it on the show this week, but we will in a future week. There is a new update to sterilization methods. FDA is recognizing new sterilization methods, which is really cool to see. But here's new entries. This is where I wanted to get to. New entries. General requirements for medical suction equipment. Basic safety and essential performance of infant cardiorespiratory monitors. No wonder there if things like the owlet and things like that influenced this change. Basic safety and essential performance of ventilators for emergency medical services environments. Those last two, almost no question where these came from. Why were these standards updated? Why have they been consensus? We've seen a lot in these two areas over the last few years. No new entries for biocompatibility. Cardiovascular extracorporeal systems, blood and tissue contact surface modifications for that, probably having to do with growth in those systems that has been a cause of concern over the years. There's new things for dental, intraoral mirrors, manual toothbrushes, general requirements and test methods. If you're going to sell a toothbrush, you want to know how to test it, as well as biocompatibility of medical devices used in dentistry. So these are all new standards, ones that didn't exist or weren't consensus before, but now you're going to want to be following them. Computational solid mechanics and computational fluid dynamics and heat transfer. There are actually FDA consensus standards surrounding this that you want to be thinking about if you're making a pre-market submission, as well as some updates, basic safety and essential performance for blankets, pads, and mattresses for heating and medical use, hypodermic syringes, and antifungal susceptibility testing of yeasts. When you get down to OBGYN and urology, extracorporeal systems, tongue-tied, focus heavily down there, as well as sheeting and catheters. So again, something you're just going to have to go through and look at, work with whoever you're working with to say, hey, are there any updated standards? Don't just tell me the last standard that you saw. Can we check? Here's what you want to do as a startup. Can we check the FDA consensus standards list? Can we breeze through it? Can we take a look and see if there's any updated or new standards? You can go to the Federal Register here, or you can search by category on the FDA webpage. A lot of new stuff for interoperability, artificial intelligence, machine learning down here. This is going to be of interest to a lot of folks. I'll let that linger on the screen for just a minute because there's a lot of people who are saying, how do I do AI? How do I do software? This is going to be a focus for folks. These are actually new consensus standards from FDA. From these organizations, I was talking earlier about the organizations, AMI's one, ANSI's another, IEEE, IEC, mentioned ISO earlier. There are some new standards for process control and cleaning validation, all relating to sterility as well. So again, these standards, they're not the same thing as regulations. Standards are not the same thing as regulations. They do change over time. They're recognized by FDA. They're consensused by the international community. FDA recognizes them. You have to use them during your clearance process. Have to? Well, not quite. They're voluntary, but certain ones are all but required. And some of them are just a good idea because how else are you going to answer these questions? If the standard exists, FDA is going to ask you about these types of questions. Usually the right answer is may as well comply with the standard, and then provide the declaration of conformity and any evidence for that to the agency as a part of your pre-market submission. So make sure you're up to date on the latest standards. Know where they enter your device development process. As a hint, it's during the design control process. While you're thinking about your inputs, while you're thinking about the inputs to your device design, make sure that you're thinking about the standards that apply. Some of those will turn into requirements effectively for you. You'll comply with those during the design outputs, as well as during verification and validation. So if you're already to your device design and just now saying, how do I comply with standards, it might be a little bit too late to not have to back up. But if you're early enough in that process, or you need to back up, make sure you get those standards thought about in your design input process so that they can be addressed in design outputs and verification and validation. If you like what you heard today, please like and subscribe. Help us keep bringing you medtech education on MedTech Crossroads. What's happening with FDA meeting timelines? How long are FDA delays? How is FDA working post-COVID-19? On this segment of MedTech Crossroads, we're going to answer these questions using a recent update from FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health and talk about what it means for startup medtech companies. MedTech Crossroads is brought to you by IntuBeing, your medical device development partner. Free learning from MedTech Crossroads will save you headaches on your medical device development journey. So let's get to this news item. Here's the article from CDRH, Emerging from the Pandemic, CDRH in-person meeting status and pre-market workload. Everybody knows that FDA was working like crazy during COVID-19. Even the main processes that they were trying to run, many of them had to be put on the back burner. In-person meetings were shut down. Much of the staff's attention turned to processing emergency use authorizations and working through what they could do. The joke was always when FDA would say, hey, can we call you on the weekend? And everyone laughed because FDA never calls you on the weekend. You have to nag them usually. Well, that's all changing. And this is actually a pretty exciting update from FDA. And of course, here from Jeff Shuren and Dr. Bill Mazel at the agency. 3.5 years they were dealing with COVID-19, and they highlight the resiliency of FDA's staff. Indeed, they did a great job during the pandemic. It's been challenging ever since, the turnover at the agency, and everyone's been looking for what is the new normal. Well, they're getting bold enough to declare that the new normal is here and has been here. In fact, they didn't need to say this, but I think it's interesting. We observed a recent resurgence in device innovation. For example, CDRH has received more submissions for novel devices over the past 12 months than during any 12-month period since we began tracking this metric in 2015. That's actually really, really cool. Now, when they say novel devices, I think they're focused there on breakthrough device pathway, de novo, and safer technologies program devices. So it's not all device submissions. We could look at those numbers, but they're getting more submissions than ever for novel devices. And they're certainly creating the pathways for those. Here's some really good news too. We're accepting and holding in-person meetings with stakeholders and have been doing so for quite some time. So just know that this is an option. In-person meetings are an option with FDA. That doesn't get to the timeline quite yet, but that is an option. We're going to talk about the timeline question here in just a moment. It's not that you have to do it in person. Remember, when you do something like a pre-submission with FDA, you can ask for written feedback. You're going to get written feedback. You're going to get written feedback, and you can ask for an in-person or a teleconference with the agency. If you ask for the in-person and it turns out you don't need it because the written feedback is so great, that's fine. You don't have to take the in-person meeting, but it's a nice option. It's great to be face-to-face with the agency. And so hybrid or only the written letter, all are options once again. So that's an option there, hybrid meetings as well. How long is it going to take? This is the big question. This is why you're here to, how long is it going to take? How long are these meetings taking? How big is the backlog? How backed up is FDA? Get this. This is good news. For requests tied to product submissions, we follow standard scheduling timelines consistent with MDUFA, Medical Device User Fee Act 5 performance goals. Now, it may be limited by facility capacity and logistical considerations, but it is our intention, wow, look at these words, these are great, to accommodate in-person meeting requests wherever feasible. And their target is the MDUFA 5 performance goals. Yeah, and it's true, sometimes it won't happen exactly like they would like it to, But they're actually back to not saying, ooh, probably isn't going to happen. They're actually saying we're now back to targeting what our goals were supposed to be. In fact, CDRH is pleased to announce that we've been operating under normal review timelines for all incoming pre-market submissions for almost a year as of the writing of this document, which is 8/2, which is 2 days ago. So FDA, in answer to the question you came here for, FDA is operating under normal review timelines for all incoming pre-market submissions for almost a year, and they're intending for in-person meetings to meet their MDUFA 5 goals. That is just wonderful news. There's fewer than 80 EUAs still left in the pipeline, mostly in vitro diagnostic tests for COVID-19. And they're in the process of all the transition. There's more than 30 EUA devices have successfully transitioned to traditional authorization through the 510K or de novo pathways, but that is starting to wind down and to be something that is coming out of the process. Now, a few more words about FDA 510K and pre-sub timelines, because a lot of you may be asking, well, I don't know if I need an in-person meeting, but I just want to know, how long does it take? How long is my 510K going to take? How long is my pre-sub going to take? Here's what FDA says in their 510K documentation. The FDA goal to make a MDUFA decision for a 510K is 90 FDA days. Those are calendar days between the date the 510K was received and the date of a decision, excluding the days that it was on hold for an additional information request. So that's something that is going to take extra time. 510Ks don't usually take truly 90 days because FDA does a refuse to accept checklist, and then they will come back out once they've started the review for additional information. They almost always do. So it will take longer than that, but think 90 days for your 510K once it's submitted to the agency. Another common question about timelines has to do with the, somehow I didn't make it in here, the 70-day timeline to an in-person meeting for pre-subs and related informational meetings. So you should expect about 70 days. You're going to get about 60, 65 days to a letter, and then 70 to the actual in-person meeting for that. So a little bit of information on FDA timelines, but the good news is that FDA pre-market reviews have been happening inside their goals for the last year, and it turns out that for in-person meetings, the goal is to meet the MDUFA 5 timelines. They're not hemming and hawing. They're not saying this probably won't happen. They're saying we're back to normal. And that is really exciting news. If you like what you heard today, please like and subscribe to help keep us bringing you free medtech education. What is FDA's latest software guidance for 510K submission? FDA does have new software guidance issued in June this year. On this segment of MedTech Crossroads, we're going to look at the newest FDA software guidance for pre-market submissions and look at a timely example of a medical device recall that shows why FDA is focused on software functions. Software functions is appropriate. We'll also talk about what it all means for startup medtech companies. MedTech Crossroads is brought to you by Into2Being, your medical device development partner. Free learning from MedTech Crossroads will save you headaches on your medical device development journey. So let's get into this. Here we're staring right at the new pre-market submissions for device software functions guidance document, hot off the press in June of this year. The draft was issued on November 4th of 2021. And what you'll notice about this document, just from looking at the index, there are certainly things that you're going to expect to see. How much documentation do you need? Software description, risk management file, software requirement specification, software and system architecture diagram, software design specification, Development, configuration management, maintenance best practices. Software testing as a part of verification and validation. Look, none of this stuff is really that unusual for software development or for medical device development. It's kind of the hybrid of what you would expect to see. What's expected out of the design controls process from FDA, including verification and validation? Cool. How does that merge with typical software development practices? Things that you don't see from most other parts of a medical device, like a software requirement specification, an architecture diagram, design specification of software specific. So if you just take those two things and merge them, you're going to see a lot that you're expecting to see. The intent here is to harmonize more and more with 62304, the international consensus standard. But keep in mind, things are a little bit split because FDA still has its own software lifecycle expectations. And this section here having to do with what you submit to them as a part of a pre-market submission. But I want you to look just at the title. I don't need anything more than the title right now. Content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. This has been a typical problem to get the industry to understand that at some level, there's nothing fundamentally different about software versus a hardware-based medical device, whether it includes electronics or not. It does something. There's an intended purpose to the device or to the software function. And what that function has to do allows you to characterize the risk associated with it. It allows you to identify what you should do to mitigate in the case of a failure relative to that function. And that's really what the focus is here. When you get down to the documentation sections of this document, they basically have, here's the definition of a device software function. It's a distinct purpose of the product, which could be the intended use or a subset of the intended use of the product. So just what we said a second ago. They define a whole bunch of other terms, and then they come to documentation level. Enhanced documentation should be provided for any pre-market submission that includes device software functions where a failure or a flaw of any device function could present a hazardous situation with a probable risk of death or serious injury. I tell you what, it's going to be pretty easy to fall within enhanced documentation. The more software there is, the more likely it is that you'll find yourself in enhanced documentation. And that's not the end of the world. We'll look in a second at what enhanced documentation includes. Basic documentation for anything that has device software functions, but enhanced documentation doesn't apply, so it's the fallback. The recommended documentation for the two levels, there's always going to be a documentation level evaluation to say which you are of these two levels, a description of the software, risk management file components, a software requirement specification, a software and system architecture design. But then here's where it gets interesting. The enhanced has a software design specification, but you don't need to submit that as a part of the pre-market submission if you're in the basic documentation level. But FDA wants to understand the technical design details of how the software functions as a part of the enhanced level of documentation. Software development, configuration management, and maintenance practices. You can make a summary, or you can make a declaration of conformity to certain parts of 62304. And that's an either or. But there's sort of a, they want to see the complete configuration management stuff as a part of enhanced documentation. What about testing? Software testing as a part of verification and validation. A summary description and protocols, including acceptance criteria. Did we just say that? Acceptance criteria. Can we all say that together, please? Acceptance criteria. If we're going to hear testing, I want to hear acceptance criteria in the same breath. Please, never, ever again, after hearing this segment, talk about testing if you're not talking about acceptance criteria. What are you testing? What's success and failure? What's pass-fail? For enhanced documentation level, basic documentation plus the protocols the unit and integration test protocols. So if we look back at the left side, system level test protocols. But at the enhanced documentation level, both the unit and the integration level. Both require software version history and both require unresolved software anomalies to be documented as a part of this. There's a lot of great stuff in this guidance. We will not touch it all. It's a relatively long guidance. They go into detail about what needs to be included in these different things, which is really great because with software, so many times people are looking at it saying, what do I need to document? Here's how my coders work. This is what they do. I don't understand what FDA wants. Well, good news. They're actually starting to specify it. They're starting to just say, you know what? Here, you can do this. There are examples as a part of this document. But let's not stop with the guidance. I wanted to focus on the very basic title of the guidance, software functions, because so much of what you do with a medical device comes down to what are you saying it does? What is the function you're trying to get? Well, it turns out that this is exactly where failures come. They come at a function level. The function either does or doesn't happen. Technically, behind the scenes, it could be because of the software. It could be because of the electronics. It could be because of the hardware. It could be because of training. It could be because of labeling. There's so many ways that you can make the device work or not work, and a lot of those are implementation decisions. So let's look at a current example. Again, hot off the press, 3 days ago, Baxter Healthcare Corporation recalls Sigma Spectrum infusion pumps with master drug library for repeat upstream occlusion false alarms. Now, it's worth noting that this is not the first Class 1 recall. They identified this as a Class 1 recall, the most serious type of recall. It could cause serious injuries or death. Which type of software documentation do we think they need? Enhanced, right? Because if you can have failures of software that could create serious injury or death, you need enhanced documentation. Now that would have all, this device would have been cleared before that requirement came out, so that's just water under the bridge. But it points to the reason why FDA, I'm not saying Baxter is the reason why this came out, but it points to the reason why FDA is focusing on guidance like this. Because there are certain functions that if you don't pay enough attention to them, in the documentation, in the testing, you're going to get failures. Now, it turns out this is the second failure of this system. Number 2, this is the second time it's failed. It turns out, and we'll get to this in the document, that false alarms were not their problem the first time. The first time the problem is that it was not alarming for upstream occlusions. So they did a Class 1 recall. They made software patches, they rolled them out, and for that function, this function, what's the function? What's the subset of the intended use? The function is we need to tell people if there's an upstream occlusion in our infusion pump. We got to tell people. Well, it wasn't always telling people. Sometimes it wasn't saying you have an occlusion. Oh boy, the flow is stopped, right? So they patched it. And now it's telling people too frequently that there's an occlusion, even when there's not an occlusion. So this infusion pump, and we're not singling Baxter out here, this is just an example for educational purposes, right? Public information here. I'm sure they're doing their best to get this thing all cleaned up. False alarms for upstream occlusion after pump software upgrades. Well, it turns out these pump software upgrades were to fix the previous Class 1 recall. Why are false occlusion alarms a problem? Well, clinician fatigue, alarm fatigue is a real thing. And if a doctor goes rushing in there to try to fix something and it turns out to be nothing, they could do damage simply by rushing in and doing something too quickly. But if they're having to run into room after room after room for false occlusion alarms, they're not going to be paying attention to the real problems that are out there. Unfortunately, there's not a solution for this until another software version is completed. So this will be not the version that got the first Class 1 recall, not the version that got the second Class 1 recall. This will be the version that hopefully fixes the problem. And they want users to report these things, that they're using these. But here's the thing that was the most interesting, right? The software versions, the subject of this recall, were created to address a previous Class 1 recall for the other versions that presented a risk of these pumps not alarming for repeated upstream occlusion events. So this is just an example. Again, we wish companies that end up in this position all the best. Obviously, it's not an enviable place to be, but it is instructional to us as a community to understand the type of documentation, the type of testing that FDA is now asking for as a part of their latest software guidance. There are reasons for it. They do see things like this in the marketplace. So what is FDA's latest software guidance? Well, you just saw it. It came out in June. The link will be in the description. And there are good reasons why they're doing it. Enhanced documentation, basic documentation, having to do with whether your software is capable of harming somebody or whether it just performs some functions that really, if they fail or go bad, it's not going to be the end of the world. But many of you who are doing software on your devices can expect enhanced documentation, which is going to have just a few more requirements like we saw earlier in the segment. If you like what you heard today, please like and subscribe to help us keep you. Let me try that again. If you like what you heard today, please like and subscribe to help us keep bringing you free medtech education on MedTech Crossroads. Well, that's segment 3 for today. We're going to open it up for questions. If you have questions about what we've covered, or you have events that you'd like us to report on, in just a second, we're going to go to the local events. We're going to tell you all about the local and national events that are happening in our ecosystem. But feel free, if you're listening to us on YouTube, you can type it into the chat on YouTube. We'd love to hear from you there. If you're listening on Zoom, thank you for our listeners on Zoom. It's always so good to see you there every week. And we will take your hand raised. I think we can bring you live on audio still. I think it's something we can still do. If you have something you'd like to tell us, we'll do that right at the end after we talk about the local events. So get a hand up if you have something you want to tell us or you have a question about one of the segments. That's one of the cool things about the live show is you can still ask questions. Whereas when these are in replay on YouTube, it'll be a little harder to do that. But we're going to go next to local news and upcoming events. These brought to you by a number of sources. We try to cull from a lot of places. And as we go through the year, different sources have more or less content for us. So we tell you what we can find. MishBio is having the BioConnections networking on August 22nd. That is presented in partnership with Avantor. It's going to be in Royal Oak. Cost $10 unless you're a MishBio member, in which case it is free. It will be at the Brown Iron Brewery, Woodward Avenue, Royal Oak, Michigan. And you can, in today's live show description, you can find that link. The Midwest Showcase. Turns out I'm going to be speaking there, as well as a number of other people that you may know. This put on by Project MedTech. The Midwest Showcase is happening August 30th. We are already to August. It's already that month. I can't believe it. In Cleveland, Ohio. So we will look forward to seeing you there at the Midwest Showcase. Come on down. It'd be good to see people at in-person events again. It'd be really cool. The Women in MedTech Forum is happening, sponsored by Mass Medic, September 7th. That's going to be in Massachusetts. But honestly, I tell you what, I've gone to Mass Medic events before, and it's an easy trip over there, and been some really great stuff, great access to people in that ecosystem. Celebrate Invention, the University of Michigan's annual amazing event, a great place to reconnect with local folks, happening September 14th, 3 to 6 p.m. at the Michigan Union. Free and open to the public. Resi, Boston, if you want to get in contact with investors, September 18th through 20th, 2023, happening in Boston. The Michigan Life Sciences Showcase, September 18th in Lansing. They're going to have all sorts of content there, including medical devices, drugs, pharma, cannabis, healthcare, all of the above. And we're going to hear more about this next week. I'm looking forward to catching back up with Jeff Reinvelt of Renaissance Venture Partners. We're going to talk a little bit more than just on Demo Day, but on Demo Day is happening October 10th through 11th, and the registration deadlines will be coming up. I don't have the exact dates for those yet, but get in contact with Christina D at RenVCF. This is going to be at Ford Field. Great chance to get your idea in front of investors and for investors to see cool new ideas. The MedTech Conference coming up October 9th through 11th in Anaheim, California. This put on by AdvaMed. And the Startup Symposium, also by Project MedTech, coming up in Houston, Texas at Texas Medical Center. The Combination Products Summit and AI Summits are coming back to Columbus, Ohio. These used to be Xavier conferences, and I was at the last one along with Into Adrian Harris and Marla Phillips, who was the original originator of the Xavier conferences, among others. Just a beautiful handoff. They handed the conference off because Xavier was no longer able to continue them, handed it off to RAPS and AFTO. So it looks like that long-standing conference. Talk about not caring who gets the credit, wanting to see the idea continue. Anytime I think of that conference, I will think of Marla and team and how they handed it off so graciously when Xavier was not able to continue that to RAPS and AFTO. So coming up at the end of the year. And we had Dr. Hesberg on last year. It was an amazing chat about cognition. We think of eyesight as being important, but is eyesight actually as important as what you do with that information when it comes through? Dr. Hesberg runs two conferences. The one this year is the Eye and the Chip 2023, Synthetic Vision, Artificial Vision, at the Southfield Westin Hotel, October 8th through 10th. And so that is coming up very quickly as well. That's what we've got for the local news. If you want to talk to us, contact at medtechcrossroads.com. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Let us know how we can help you, what kinds of things you're interested in. We love talking about topics that are of interest to you. As I mentioned at the outset of the show, we're doing a lot more segments now. So these segments are going to be findable. We love having you on the live show, and we're going to keep doing that. There's a bunch of you on YouTube and a bunch of you on Zoom as well. So it's just fun to see old faces there as well. There's always the opportunity to interact live. It keeps me energized. The reason we're pausing in between each of the segments, and we'll do so even when we have some interviews again like Jeff next week, there's going to be pauses in between, because what we're going to do is we're cutting these up after the fact. So, for example, if someone is out there searching for what's the latest software guidance for FDA submissions, or next week somebody's going to be saying, how do I get in front of investors from my tech startup, right? There's a question out there. There's billions of people searching the internet every day, and some of them are asking questions about how do I get in front of investors? And so when we take Jeff's segment, and we're going to be talking about that together, when we take Jeff's segment, we're going to chop that up, and now somebody who's anywhere in the country who might be able to come to Undemo Day is going to be able to find that video. Hopefully YouTube's serving it up to them, which means the Michigan ecosystem can get that much more visibility, finding ways to get the word out there. Well, I thank you for being with us today. I look forward to being with you next week on MedTech Crossroads.